Well, this is exciting for me. It's the first time I've taught about self-compassion, specifically to teachers and educators. So I am really excited. I'm also very grateful for the warm welcome, because I do obviously think that self-compassion is very important for educators and also in the schools. And I'm just going to tell you up front. Oh, am I not up? Is that better? Yes. Okay. All right. I just want to tell you up front that I know I'm going to get the question, who's teaching self-compassion to kids in schools? And the answer is, at this point, no one. It hasn't really gone there yet. We've just been developing interventions for adults. There's mindfulness in the schools, which maybe you've heard about, but you all might be pioneers in terms of figuring out how to bring some of the principles I'm going to talk about to your classrooms. All right, so you're on the cutting edge. So I'm very excited to be bringing this work into more directly into the realm of education. But so what I'm going to do today is talk more generally about self-compassion. I'm going to start with more of a presentation about the core concepts of self-compassion, and then we'll get into some exercises after our break, which I assume we're having at some point. Good. So. You can call the break. I can call the break. Okay. If you're good, I'll give you a break. If you pay attention. All right. So self-compassion. How did I end up devoting my life to this idea of self-compassion, which I really have. It's my life's work. I suspect I'll be doing it till the day I die. And it's because of Berkeley. I was actually, I went here for my PhD, and it was my last year on this very campus, and I was undergoing a lot of stress. I was, wondering, am I going to finish my PhD? And I had some anxiety about that, but the real anxiety was, well, after I get my PhD, after 7 years, am I going to get a job, right? And I also had a lot of issues going on in my personal life. It was a pretty stressful time for me. So what am I going to do about all this stress? Well, when in Rome, do as the Romans. When in Berkeley, learn how to meditate, right? I'm in Berkeley. Like, of course, what else do you do in Berkeley but learn how to meditate? So it was actually down in Albany I was living. There was a Buddhist meditation group that I started learning to meditate with. And the very first night I went to the group, the woman leading the group talked about the importance of compassion, which I was expecting, right? It's a Buddhist group. But what I wasn't expecting is she spent most of her time talking about how important it was to have compassion for yourself. That you couldn't really have true compassion for others until you also opened your heart to yourself. And at that moment, I realized that was exactly what I needed to do. I needed to help and support myself through the stressful experience I was having. And I actually started trying to make a change in terms of how I spoke to myself, being less critical, being more kind, understanding, and supportive. And it made a huge difference almost immediately. So, maybe just to say that this is really coming from a personal place for me. This isn't an academic pursuit. I fell in love with self-compassion well before I even started researching the idea. But that's why I'm such an evangelist, because I've seen it work over and over and over again in my personal life. But before getting into self-compassion, what it is, I want to take a little detour, which is kind of coincides with my story of researching self-compassion. And that is discussing what I learned when I did get a job. Yay, I got a postdoc for 2 years after Berkeley at the University of Denver with Susan Harder, who's one of the country's leading self-esteem researchers, especially on the development of self-esteem. And it was while working with her in Denver that I started learning more about self-esteem and some of the problems with self-esteem, and therefore eventually thought I would look at self-compassion as an alternative. But I'm going to spend some time talking about self-esteem because you're all educators, and we know the emphasis that's often placed on the importance of raising kids' self-esteem in the schools. So I want to talk about some of the potential dangers of that. Okay. So first, just to define what I mean by self-esteem. Now, self-esteem can be defined in a variety of different ways. So everything I'm going to be talking about now is just in relation to this particular way of defining it, and that is a global evaluation of self-worth, putting yourself, all your various behaviors into a box labeled good or bad or somewhere in between. So basically, am I a good person? Am I a bad person? Am I an average person? That's what I'm meaning about what is self-esteem, a global evaluation of self-worth. And as you know, there were hundreds, thousands of books written about self-esteem, almost 10,000 journal articles on self-esteem, and primarily, at least at first, its benefits. And that actually is the complete idiot's guide to self-esteem, if you were wondering, right? Lots of books written for children. And the reason there was such an emphasis on self-esteem as really seeing it as the key to psychological well-being is we know that if you have low self-esteem, if you hate yourself, you're going to have all sorts of psychological problems. You're going to be depressed, you're going to be anxious. Whereas if you have high self-esteem, you're going to be more motivated, you're going to feel better about yourself. And because of that, for really good intentions, there was a big self-esteem movement in the schools. California, being the leader, had the most intentional effort to raise kids' self-esteem. And what's happened, though, you're probably aware, the last 10 years, psychology has started falling out of love with self-esteem. And that's because the problem isn't having self-esteem, it's how you get it, right? There's no doubt that it's better to have high self-esteem than low self-esteem, better to like yourself than to hate yourself. But there are healthy and unhealthy ways to get your high self-esteem, and that's what I want to talk about for a moment. Okay. So certainly in American culture, to have high self-esteem, we need to be special and above average, right? So anyone here, if I said, Jessica, your work as a teacher, yeah, it's average.
Thanks.
How would you feel? I mean, think about it. If someone gives you feedback that you're average, it's an insult, right? It's devastating. It really is. It's devastating. If you told me that this talk was average, I'd be like, just face it. It's human reaction. We have to feel special and above average to feel good about ourselves. So what's the problem if that's our baseline for feeling good about ourselves?
Where's everybody else?
Yeah, like logical impossibility is a slight problem with this, right? It's actually impossible for us all to be above average at the same time. So that means we need to try to find psychological ways to feel above average, even if, by definition, we actually are average. So what happens is this process of social comparison gets set up. So we're always thinking, well, how do I compare to that person? Are they better than me? Or maybe is there a way I can look down on them so I feel better in comparison? But we're always looking to other people to see how we compare to them in order to decide how we feel about ourselves. And this process of social comparison can actually have some pretty nasty consequences. All right, so one is narcissism. Some people take this need to feel special and above average a little too seriously and start feeling that not only am I above average, I'm actually superior, right? I'm superior, I'm entitled. And how many of you know the work of Jean Twenge and Keith Campbell? Jean Twenge wrote this great book called Generation Me. Basically, they've been studying levels of narcissism for the past 25 years. And what they found is they were going up and up and up and up and up. And about 5 years ago, they, thank God, leveled off. But basically, the highest levels of narcissism ever recorded among college undergraduates. And her argument is that partly because of anyway, the self-esteem movement in the schools and very well-meaning parents and teachers trying to help kids feel good about themselves, a lot of people, again, took that message too seriously and started feeling entitled and better than others. And it's funny, I've been teaching at UT Austin just since '99, and I could even see the difference in terms of, what, I gotta be, that's not okay, and I want my money back, basically, that kind of attitude, right? And so that's a slight problem when people start taking the need for self-esteem too seriously. Here's a little Calvin and Hobbes cartoon. I'll read it in case you can't see it. This bad grade is lowering my self-esteem. Well, then you should work harder so you don't get bad grades. Your denial of my victimhood is lowering my self-esteem, right? How many of you had situations kind of like this? You know, or maybe with the parents, right? It's not just the kids, it's the parents, right? Okay, so this is a problem, and from your end, I don't need to explain to you why. But there's some other problems as well that maybe aren't so immediately obvious. Bullying, for instance. Or sometimes they talk about, among females, it might take more the form of relational aggression. So either physically hurting others or emotionally hurting others by talking behind your backs is kind of the reverse of that exercise you just did. Why do kids do it? Especially in middle school. Kids are starting to ask the question, who am I? Am I a good person? Am I a bad person? Bullying is a primary vehicle by which some kids try to raise their self-esteem. I'm cooler, I'm bigger than you. And actually in middle school, kids get social approval for being successful bullies, right? So that's just one of the ways in which this quest for high self-esteem can take an unhealthy turn. Prejudice also. You know, there's a lot of reasons people are prejudiced, but certainly one of them is it allows me to feel better than you. If my racial group, religious group, political group is better than yours, then I can feel better than you in comparison. A big problem with self-esteem is that it tends to be contingent. William James, who was actually one of the founding fathers of psychology, talked about this more than 100 years ago. He says self-esteem comes from perceptions of competence in domains of importance, which basically means my self-esteem depends on being good in those areas of life that I value. And the three most important domains in which most people put their self-esteem is a success. That could be success in business or maybe athletic success if you're an athlete. Social approval, right? Approval from others. I guess now literally how many likes you have on Facebook. And then perceived attractiveness. Okay. I want to talk about that middle one for just a moment, then I'll get to at least that last one. Social approval. You kind of got into that a little bit in the exercise you just did. What's really interesting in the research, and again, Susan Harder did some of this, is kids, and I would say adults as well, but especially kids, are more likely to invest their self-esteem in the perceived approval of acquaintances than friends and family. Okay, think about that, right? Well, of course my friends and family like me. It's what the other kids in school think that really determines my self-esteem. What's kind of the problem with this approach of putting all your eggs in the what other kids think basket?
Who are you?
What?
Who are you?
Right, so one of it is, not being authentic, but so really saying, of course my friends and family, they like me, but somehow it's more objective, right? What the other kids think, that's kind of the idea. What's the problem with that? Is that really true? Is it more objective? Well, it's competitive, right? So first of all, they may be doing their own self-esteem stuff.
It's just based on flash judgments we make from people. So if someone walks by and you're like,
Exactly.
oh, I don't like that person because obviously they're stuck up, but you don't know them.
That's
so
right.
Kids are saying that the flash judgments are really more important.
Exactly. So as if, the other kids don't really know you very well. They're making flash judgments, again, partly motivated by to protect their own self-esteem, and yet, our friends and family know us a lot better. They're actually in a much better position to judge, but we kind of discount that. You say?
It just puts the locus of control even further. It distances that locus of control about your self-worth.
Right. So more external, a little more.
Developmentally, middle schoolers can't do anything else. If I'm out in the yard and you glance my way, I'm sure you're looking at me. And then if you try to say something to your friend, I'm sure you're talking about me.
That's right.
And so
That's right.
developmentally, that's just how
Yeah, they call that the imaginary audience, you may know, where there's a belief that everyone's always talking about you all the time and thinking about you all the time. So of course, there's two ways in which this is a lousy source of information. First, the other people don't know you very well, but also we don't really know what other people think of us. Like in that exercise, maybe you found out, wow, that's what they thought of me? So kids are basically deciding if they're a good person or not based on this really flimsy, lousy source of information. Right? Now that's for all kids, but which one of these things do you think is especially important for girls? or women. Yeah, actually, it's kind of sad. In every culture they've looked at, perceived attractiveness has been the most important domain in which girls, and then actually women as well, tend to invest their self-esteem. And again, developmentally, there's a small problem with this because remember, it's perceptions of competence. So in other words, your perception of how attractive you think you are that largely determines your self-esteem. And this is some data from Susan Harder that she collected, starting in 3rd grade and then going to the 11th grade. Okay, so this is how attractive you think you are over time. So for males on top, right, 3rd grade, looking pretty good, feeling pretty good about myself. 7th grade, yeah, still looking pretty good, you know. 11th grade, yeah, all right, you know. And girls, you can see by 5th grade, it's taking a nosedive. I'm sorry, ladies, are men really more attractive than us? You know, right? So part of the problem, of course, is the incredible standards of beauty in our culture are unrealistic and they're airbrushed. And so that's a big problem for a lot of our girls, is they're basing their sense of self-worth on how attractive they are compared to these supermodels who, and even the supermodels feel insecure next to each other, right? So it's a bit of a problem. Just want to add this slide in because I was told this morning that this might be relevant to some of you. This is some more research by Susan Harder. Okay, so our self-esteem comes from our perceptions of competence, how good we are at domains of importance, the things we value. There's actually 2 different strategies for managing your self-esteem. One, and these are 2 children, child A and child B, with the exact same perceptions of how good they are in these different realms of life. But the kid on top has very high self-esteem, and the kid on the bottom has very low self-esteem. So the kid on top is adopting this is my term, what I call the kind of slacker phenomena, right? No, I'm not good at athletics. Athletics aren't that important to me. I am really, I'm very popular with my friends, that's really important to me. I look good, that's important to me. So in other words, what this kid is doing is only valuing those areas of life in which they feel competent. Okay? So in other words, I'm not very good at math. Math isn't important to my self-esteem. I'm not very good at maybe athletics, or it might be the reverse. I am really good at athletics. That's really important to me. So you manage your self-esteem by only valuing those areas of life that are important to you, which is a problem, of course, if you don't value academics, let's say, but the society does. But the kid on the bottom is a perfectionist. This kid wants to be good at everything. And because this kid isn't good at everything, this kid has low self-worth. Right? So you can see this, it's really a game, this self-esteem game. We're always trying to, somehow compare ourselves to others, judge ourselves. Are we up to par? Are we not up to par? Can we kind of manage this somehow? Maybe becoming prejudiced, or maybe kind of really not valuing those areas of life we're not good at. And so what happens is this game is, it's like a treadmill we can't get off. Right? It's really an unwinnable game. And so eventually what happens is we just tend to feel inadequate, right? We feel we aren't good enough, smart enough, pretty enough, likable enough, whatever it is. So again, having high self-esteem is not a bad thing, but constantly striving for self-esteem, questing for it, doing all these psychological mind games we do to try to get self-esteem is a real problem, okay? And that's why there's been a movement away, at least I presume, would you all agree, kind of a movement away of emphasizing self-esteem as much for kids for some of these reasons? Okay, but then what are you left with? Okay, go ahead and hate yourself then, right? Well, that's not good either. So the idea is, at least my idea, is that self-compassion is another way to feel good about yourself, to feel positive about yourself. It really avoids a lot of the pitfalls of self-esteem. All right, so basically what happened is when I got to UT Austin, I decided, after my postdoc, I decided I wanted to do research on self-compassion. And at that point, no one had researched it in the academic fields. A lot of people had written about it, especially in more spiritual books, but no one had looked at it academically. So I realized the first thing I needed to do was to precisely define what self-compassion is. So I'm going to give you my definition of self-compassion, and from my point of view, anyway, self-compassion really isn't different than compassion for others. The experience is the same. The only difference is that we're much more likely to give compassion to others than we are to ourselves. Right? We tend to exclude ourselves from the circle of compassion. But from my point of view, the feeling is actually the same. So to understand what self-compassion is, I like to think about, well, what has to happen in order for us to feel compassion for others? So let's say you're walking down a Telegraph Avenue, and you see this woman by the side of the street. What's the first thing that has to happen for you to have compassion for this woman?
To look at her.
Got to look at her, you got to see her, right? So if you're texting, it's not going to happen. Okay, so you got to see her. What's the next thing that has to happen for it to be compassion?
To see her as yourself.
See you as yourself, right? So that's definitely part of it. So you've got to not look down on her or see her as inferior to you. But let's say that you just got annoyed with her. You noticed her, you looked up from your text, say, would that be compassion? No, right? So you have to respond to her in a certain way. You've got to care about the fact that she's suffering. Notice her, notice she's suffering. You know, think, gosh, what's her story? What happened? Is she getting the health services she needs? And then as you say, can I see her as a fellow human being? Not feeling sorry for her, looking down on her, or pitying her, but really saying something like, there, but for the grace of God go I. So I argue those same three components are essential to self-compassion. Okay, so the first really is the most obvious, and that's treating yourself with kindness, care, understanding, empathy, as opposed to harsh self-judgment. Sometimes the easiest way to think about this is treating yourself like you'd treat a really good friend you cared about. Okay, most people are much kinder and more caring and more supportive and more encouraging to their friends than they are to themselves. If you actually stop to check in and look at the dialogue we use with ourselves, especially if we're really feeling self-critical, we say things to ourselves that are not only much more harsh and unkind than we'd say to friends, we say things that are probably more harsh and unkind that we'd say even to someone we didn't like very much. Right? We're often the absolute cruelest and harsher with ourselves. We say things to ourselves that are almost kind of shocking. Obviously, there are various levels of this, but if you actually stop to tune into the language you use with yourself, it can be pretty eye-opening. So the idea is with self-compassion, we turn that around. Instead of being judgmental and critical, we're kind, we're understanding. But it's more than just not judging yourself. There's a desire to actively soothe and comfort oneself. There's an action component to compassion. Compassion is concerned with the alleviation of suffering, which means there's also a readiness to help. Right? So this comes in with the self-kindness component of self-compassion. You know, if you had a friend who was upset, maybe got fired from their job, you might give your friend a hug and really soothe and comfort them and try to help them feel better in the moment. The same with ourselves. When we're compassionate, we respond to ourselves with that same care and comfort as we would to a good friend. The second component is, as we talked about, this sense of common humanity, right? Very, very important for self-compassion as well. Remembering that suffering and imperfection is part of the shared human experience. Every single person on this planet is flawed and has a life that contains hardship and struggle. Yeah, to different degrees, absolutely, but the common thread is that we all suffer in one way or another. Now, of course, we know this logically. No one here would disagree with that. Logically, well, of course, I know that, right? But illogically, at the irrational emotional level, we often forget this, right? So again, you get a really bad performance review at work, or I don't know, your partner rejects you or something like that. And in that moment, it feels as if everyone else is having this perfectly wonderful, happy, lovely life, and it's just me who's failed, or it's just me that's been rejected. Our perspective really narrows, and we can't see the bigger picture. And the problem with forgetting that everyone suffers, that you aren't alone in this, is it feels very, very isolating. You know, just notice that the next time you see that you're criticizing yourself. It's often accompanied with this sense of isolation and being cut off from others. When in fact, it's the very fact that we're imperfect and we suffer that connects us with others. It doesn't isolate us, it connects us. It makes us a card-carrying member of the human race, right? So with self-compassion, suffering becomes a way to connect yourself with others instead of falling into the illusion that somehow we're separate from others. And then the third component is the noticing of suffering. And that's what we can refer to as mindfulness, right? The idea is if we're to give ourselves compassion, actually to open our hearts to ourselves, we have to be willing to turn toward and acknowledge pain. Now, normally we like to fight pain or resist it or ignore it. We don't want to go there. But if we don't want to go there, we can't give ourselves compassion. So with mindfulness, we are able to actually accept the fact that, wow, this really hurts. This is really hard. And by turning towards that pain, we can respond to ourselves with an open heart. But the reason I call it mindfulness, and maybe more than just paying attention, is mindfulness has this quality of equanimity. It sees things in a balanced way. So you aren't avoiding or repressing your negative emotions and experiences. At the same time, you aren't making this big dramatic storyline. Oh my God, I gained 5 pounds. It's the worst thing in the world. I'm suffering, you know. That's not that type of mindfulness. Mindfulness just says, wow, okay, this is hard right now. I'm feeling this. But it sees things as they are, no more and no less. And you might say, well, you know, some people when I say you've got to notice your suffering, the response is, well, what do you mean I have to notice my suffering? Like, I notice nothing but my suffering. But it's really, again, if you start looking at this a little more closely, we often aren't aware of the incredible suffering we're experiencing, especially when the suffering is at the hands of our own inner critic, right? So think about it. What happens when you're criticizing yourself? You aren't identified with the part of you that feels inadequate and small. At that moment, you're inhabiting the role of the self-critic. Your back is strong and you should have known better. You la 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 la. So when you're lost in the role of self-critic, which by the way, it gives you a little self-esteem boost. I'm smart enough to know that you did badly. Our minds are kind of funky monkeys, as they say. When you're inhabiting the role of self-critic, you often don't stop to tune into the incredible pain you're causing yourself with that. Or the other thing we do is, because we don't like to acknowledge that we're in pain, is we go straight into fix-it mode. How can I get rid of this problem? Who can I call? What can I do? How can I manage the situation, right? So again, think if a friend came to you who was really upset. Maybe they got in a car accident. You know, if that was us, we'd like, okay, call the insurance company, what do I have to do? With your friend, you'd say, oh my God, give me a hug, you must be so upset, how difficult. But how often do we really pause to give ourselves that type of soothing and comfort when we really need it, okay? So, to have self-compassion, we really need all these 3 elements. And I want to actually give you a little experience of these as opposed to just talking about them, so you can get a sense of what I'm referring to. If you wouldn't mind putting down your pens or coffee cups. And if everyone can put your hands out in front of you like this and squeeze your fists really hard. All right, give them a good old squeeze. For those of you with long nails, I am sorry. This is a little more of an intense exercise, but please bear with me. Okay, as you make this gesture, what comes up for you? What emotional responses come up for you? Anger, tension? Anything else? Stiff, okay, stressful?
Stuck.
Okay, stuck. So this in some ways, and keep them clenched, sorry. I'll be quick. This is what self-criticism feels like, isn't it? White knuckling it, tension, and also like, you know, beating yourself up. Okay, now release your fists and have your palms upward like this. Okay, so what comes up when you do this? Release. Sorry, what?
I feel like wanting to take a deep breath.
Deep breath, relaxing, light, aliveness. Did you say? Openness, receptiveness, right. So this is what you might say is a gesture of mindfulness. Right? What happens when we stop fighting our experience, when we kind of accept our experience and ourselves as we are. Now, take both arms and extend them forward like this. So what comes up for you when you make this gesture? Sorry, what? Heaviness? Connectedness. So it's okay if your hands have been up for a while. Welcoming, connectedness. Receptiveness. So this you might say is a kind of gesture representing our common humanity, our interconnectedness, giving, receiving. Now, hugging. Put one hand over the other and place both hands over the center of your chest. You can just closing your eyes for a moment and feel the warmth of your hands, the gentle pressure, maybe even the beating of your heart. Okay, so what comes up for you when you make this gesture? Comfort, safe, peace,
Care.
love, care. Yeah, feels pretty good, huh? It was funny, I was talking about self-compassion to a group of vets in Austin, all males, and there was this one vet who looked like he was about 7 foot tall. He probably wasn't, but big guy, muscled, bald, covered with tattoos. I'm like, okay, now I'm going to have them put their hands on their hearts. You know, how's this going to go? I felt like a total, fish out of water. And I asked, okay, how does it feel when you do this? And the big burly guy said, I never want to let go. And I swear the entire hour I talked to them, he didn't. He kept his hands on his heart. This is a really powerful gesture, and you could feel that soothing, comforting quality of really that gesture of self-compassion. But there's a reason why physiologically we can get these responses. It's pretty reliable. I've given this talk many times, and we usually get the same responses. And that's because there are different physiological underpinnings of both self-criticism and self-compassion. So what's happening with self-criticism is we are actually tapping into the body's threat defense system, our reptilian brain. So this is actually one of our oldest evolved systems, and it developed so that when there was a threat in the environment, like a saber-toothed tiger was chasing us, our amygdala would get triggered, it released cortisol and adrenaline, and we can go into the fight or flight response. Okay? Very, very useful, necessary safety system to protect our bodily selves. However, typically nowadays, the threats are not so much to our bodily selves, the threats are to our self-concept, right? We confuse our actual selves with our thoughts about ourselves, but our body doesn't really know the difference. So when I get that bad performance evaluation at work, or someone says that nasty thing, my self-concept feels threatened, or if I notice something about myself I don't like, my self-concept feels threatened, and so we go into fight or flight mode, and we attack the problem being ourselves, right? So we know when we're self-critical, it releases massive amounts of cortisol, for instance, makes us feel very stressed, and eventually we will become depressed because the system kind of shuts down in response to all that activation. And of course, the self-criticism, it's a double whammy because we are both the attacker and the attacked. So, it's a bit of a problem relying investing our sense of safety into this threat defense system, the amygdala, the reptilian brain. Luckily, however, we aren't just reptiles, we are also mammals. Nature evolved a second way to help us feel safe, and that's with the mammalian attachment system, the caregiving system, self-soothing system. There's lots of names for this. But basically, the idea is what happened with the advent of mammals is mammalian young are born very, very immature, which allows them to develop to the point where they can be as capable as they are. And so there had to be a system that evolved that kept the infant safe long enough for them to go out into the wild on their own. So all mammals have this caregiving system built in, which is, allows us to respond with feelings of safety, comfort, in response to the three main ones are warmth, gentle vocalizations, and soothing touch. Dr. Keltner, who's part of Greater Good, has done a lot of research in this area. So, and our bodies respond, again, whether or not this is coming from mommy lion or coming from ourselves. So one of the reasons that feels so good and so comforting when we give ourselves a physical gesture of comfort and warmth is our bodies respond naturally, okay? So in a way, what we're doing with self-compassion is we're helping us to feel safe more from this system, through the comfort caregiving system, as opposed to trying to just fight all the problems all the time. Let me talk a little bit about why self-compassion isn't more prevalent. It's starting to change a little bit, which is nice, but how many of you would say that when you grew up, you're really encouraged to be compassionate to yourself? No. How many of your friends, if you've tried talking about it, maybe raise an eyebrow, like, or maybe your principals, or I don't know, your administrators. All right, so there's a lot of skepticism about self-compassion, and a lot of people aren't quite sure if it's a good thing. There's actually some real cultural blocks to it. And there's actually a lot of reasons for this, but I just want to talk about, again, a few of the main ones. One is people think that self-compassion is weak, complacent, and passive, right? It's like soft, squishy, hearts and flowery stuff, right? So if I'm saying, actually I remember a New York Times article came out on the self-compassion work, and one comment really stood out for me, which is so typical of this point of view, which is, oh great, just that we need a nation of sissies, right? So if you're self-compassionate, will you become a sissy? A lot of people, you're afraid that's true, right? So the question is compassion really weak? Is compassion weak? Right? So think about some of the greatest leaders, especially in modern history. Dramatically fierce, strong agents of change who said, this is not okay. Compassion is concerned with the alleviation of suffering. And so when suffering occurs, compassion can be quite fierce and say, this is not okay, we need to make a change. It can be very, very strong. The reason, people like Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King were so effective, though, is as they took a fierce stance against injustice and harm, they didn't cut anyone out of their hearts. They didn't dehumanize anyone. And that actually made them stronger and more able to make effective change. And I'm going to argue in a little bit, and we'll do an exercise later, the same thing with ourselves. Okay? This is another really common one, right? People confuse self-compassion with just giving pleasure to yourself. Isn't it self-indulgent? Actually in some even religious traditions, it's almost considered a sin to be nice to yourself, that you're just, you're being self-indulgent, you aren't being a proper, strong person. So again, if you're concerned with your own health and well-being and you don't want to suffer, are you going to eat those 3 tubs of Ben & Jerry's ice cream, right? So maybe in the short term, that might taste kind of good, at least the first tub. By the 3rd tub, it's probably starting to not taste so good. But in the long term, you're going to cause yourself a lot of harm, right? So self-compassion is always has its eye on the prize, and that is our health and well-being. So just as a compassionate mother doesn't say to her kid, yeah, eat all the candy you want, skip school, stay up till 2 in the morning watching TV reruns, a compassionate mother says, eat your vegetables, do your homework, go to bed on time. The same with ourselves, right? And sometimes people ask, how do I know if I'm being self-indulgent or self-compassionate? And sometimes you don't really know from the outside. This is the dividing line. If I do something and it's really helping me be well, like, I don't know, getting a massage, right? Sometimes getting a massage is an incredible act of compassion. You really need it. It's so rejuvenating, and you're stressed, it's good. But then you start getting a massage like every other day and you can't really afford it. You're getting kind of addicted to the massage, Then it starts becoming self-indulgent. So if it's harming you, it's probably self-indulgence, but if it's helping you, it's self-compassion, and that's really the difference there. This is a big one, confusion with making excuses. I get this a lot, like, oh yeah, it's only human. It means you're just blowing off responsibility, right? So don't we have to be, to take responsibility, don't we have to be tough on ourselves? Well, actually, and I'm going to show you some research in a bit to support this, it's just the opposite. If we know that that admitting to messing up or making mistakes is going to be met with a barrage of self-criticism, it's much easier for me to blame someone else and not to own up to it. What happens with self-compassion is it actually gives you the safety to take responsibility, the safety to admit your mistakes. If I'm only human, if it's only human to make mistakes, that means I can say, yes, mea culpa, I did do it, and therefore to take responsibility for it. The biggest one, though, the biggest block to self-compassion, actually Paul Gilbert, who does work in this area, has developed a measure called fear of self-compassion. It's actually fears of self-compassion largely for this reason. This is the belief that we need our harsh self-criticism to motivate ourselves. For some people, you say, try to be more self-compassionate, and they feel like they're giving away their most powerful tool for life. They've relied on their self-criticism to get them through to motivate themselves. And of course, wasn't this the parenting philosophy not too long ago? Spare the rod, spoil the child, right? And so we've dropped that for parenting, at least most of us have, hopefully, but we still cling to it for ourselves. So the idea with using self-criticism as a motivator is this kind of the carrot and stick approach. The carrot is, okay, maybe I feel okay about myself if I reach my goals, and if I don't, I'm going to beat myself with self-criticism, and that's what keeps me moving. It does kind of work to a certain extent, but there are downsides with this approach in that if we're constantly criticizing ourselves whenever we don't reach our goals, we're going to start losing faith in ourselves. And remember, we're going to release all this cortisol, which is going to make us become depressed, and depression is really not a good mind state in which to be motivated. So there is a second way we can motivate ourselves, and that is with compassion. If we care about ourselves, if we don't want to suffer, and if we want to thrive and be happy, that's another reason to try to reach our goals. Okay? And it's actually a much more sustainable way to motivate ourselves to reach our goals. And it's really easy to see this if we think about the parent-child example. Okay? So let's say there's a father, and his son comes home from school with a failing math grade. And the father has two potential ways to motivate his child to do better next time. Okay? The first is with harsh criticism. The son comes home and the father says, first thing he says is, I'm ashamed of you. You're a failure. What a loser. You'll never amount to anything. But isn't that kind of what we say to ourselves, right? Those kind of harsh words. So what's going to happen if the father does that? The son might try a little bit next time, but if he can, he'll probably just drop math altogether and start majoring in basketball because it's just too scary to try again if he might get beat up like that again by his father if he fails, right? What if the father takes a more compassionate approach, though, and first actually says, gives the kid compassion for the failure. Oh man, give me a hug. Hey, I love you anyway. It happens to everyone. You know, it doesn't mean you're a failure, but here's the key though. But I know you got to get your math grades up to go to college. You want to go to college. What can I do to help? How can I support you? How can I encourage you? I believe in you. I know you can do it. The kid's going to be so much more motivated to make a change and will be so much more able to sustain the motivational efforts over time with his father's love, support, and encouragement as opposed to harsh criticism. You see the faces in here. You all totally get this. For parents and probably yourself as teachers, that maybe some of you still haven't totally gotten on board for how we motivate ourselves, right? Motivating ourselves is also much more effective in the context of self-compassion. You might say that what self-compassion is doing is it's providing the optimal emotional environment for growth and change. It's like the sunshine, the fertilizer, and the water we need to thrive and grow and learn and become our best. But, and this is a cartoon, with the caveat, if possible. So this says, yeah, well, the Dalai Lama never had to deal with your whining. The reason this is important is with self-compassion, although we want to reach our ideals, we care about ourselves, we want to achieve our goals, it also recognizes that we still aren't always going to succeed. That we can try our best, but sometimes we will fail, and that's okay too. So that's really one of the reasons why self-compassion is a more powerful motivational force. All right, let me just really briefly go over some of the research on self-compassion. which isn't primarily done with the test tube, actually. A few people are starting now to look at these things, chemicals associated with self-compassion, but it's very new. The large majority of research, although this is changing, is there with the self-compassion scale I developed. When I first decided to do research on self-compassion, I had no idea how I was going to do it. So I just created a scale that kind of captured these various components of self-compassion, really face valid ways of treating yourself. And it seems to have caught on. It got the research ball rolling, you might say. You can see there's been an exponential growth curve in studies on self-compassion, which is very exciting to see. Now there's well over 200 research articles and dissertations on self-compassion. So hopefully that will keep on going. And people are using a variety of methodologies now, not just my scale. But the research is going on all over the world, keeps on expanding, which is also very exciting. Just to give you, the bare bones of what the research says, a lot of evidence now showing that self-compassion is strongly linked to well-being. There's a strong negative link between self-compassion and things like depression, anxiety, and stress. Okay, really, really strong correlation. So self-compassion helps prevent a lot of these negative mind states like, neurotic perfectionism, stress, etc. But what's interesting is self-compassion is equally strongly linked to positive mind states. Things like happiness, life satisfaction, gratitude, some of the things Rick Hansen was just talking about from what I hear. And that's one of the beautiful things about self-compassion is when you embrace suffering with kindness, which is really what self-compassion is, you're kind of alleviating the suffering, you're reducing the negative emotions at the same time that you're generating this beautiful positive emotion of loving, connected presence. And so that's why self-compassion simultaneously reduces the negative and enhances the positive. And it's one of the reasons I think that it's so powerful and so important for mental health. We've done some research comparing self-compassion and self-esteem. And so in a way, it has the same benefits, mental health benefits of self-esteem, but it doesn't have the same pitfalls. So it's not associated with constant social comparison the way self-esteem is. Self-compassion isn't contingent on success the way self-esteem is. In fact, self-esteem is a fair weather friend. It's there for you when you're doing well, but when you fail, it just deserts you. But that's precisely where self-compassion steps in to be the friend you really need, is when you fail, then you need that, kind, supportive, caring presence the most. Also, there's no link between self-compassion and narcissism, and there's a pretty robust link between self-esteem and narcissism. Lots of research now supporting this idea that self-compassion is linked to more motivation, not less. So for instance, the personal standards of self-compassionate people are just as high. They aim just as high. The difference is what happens when they don't meet their standards. They're still kind to themselves. What that means is, A, they're less afraid of failing because it's safe to fail, and they're more likely to try again when they do fail. And there's not that much work done in the academic realm, a little bit, but it does show that students who are more self-compassionate, again, are less afraid of failure. They believe more in their own competence. They're more willing to persist at learning tasks after failure. So I think there's a lot of application here for using self-compassion in academic context to motivate students. Research linking it to certain health behaviors, things like exercising, sticking to your diet if you are trying to diet, saying no to smoking or drinking too much, going to your doctor more often. I suspect this is where we'll really start seeing money poured into research on self-compassion when the HMOs figure out that this saves money, right? Because it does seem to manifest in health behaviors. Again, lots of research now to support that self-compassion does not mean blowing off responsibility. In fact, people who are more self-compassionate are more conscientious. They're more likely to take responsibility for their past mistakes. They're more likely to want to repair and make amends for past mistakes and also to apologize. Okay, so it doesn't mean the dog ate my homework. It's saying, yes, I did it. All right. Lots of research showing it's linked to coping and resilience. Really nice study came out on divorce showing that self-compassion was the #1 predictor of how people were coping with their divorce 9 months later after the split. More important than anything else they looked at. I have a student who just defended her dissertation looking at vets coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan, and found that the level of self-compassion soldiers had really predicted things like whether or not they developed PTSD based on their combat exposure. Also, a few studies looking at chronic pain, that people are more self-compassionate, not only cope with their chronic pain more, they actually experience less, the subjective experience is less painful, which may have to do somewhat with that oxytocin opiate system going on. What about the link between self-compassion and compassion for others? Well, there is a link, and it's a little complicated. First of all, we just published a study looking at romantic relationships, 100 couples. And if any of you are on the dating market, I suggest sending them to my website and having them take that self-compassion test before you go on your first date. Because what we see is very strong relationship between being self-compassionate and being a better relationship partner. People were judged by their partners, this wasn't self-report, judged by their partners as being a lot more caring, a lot more intimate, a lot less controlling, a lot less angry and aggressive. And if you think about it, if you can meet a lot of your relationship needs for care and connectedness with yourself, you aren't so dependent on your partner doing everything exactly perfect the way you want them to all the time, and it gives you a lot more resources to give to the other in the relationship. Also associated with things like forgiveness and perspective taking. In terms of compassion for others and helping others, there is a link, but it's actually a lot smaller than you might expect it to be. And that's because, at first I was kind of perplexed by this, but if you think about this, how many people do you know who are really lovely, kind, caring, compassionate people to others, but aren't very compassionate to themselves? Right? How many of you know people like that, or maybe even are? Right? So in other words, the link isn't always there. People tend to treat themselves and others quite differently. Right? So there's also a developmental component, actually, to this. We don't know a lot about it, but among undergraduates, there's no link whatsoever, non-significant, between compassion for self and others. And then as you get older, there starts to be a link. I suspect that's that understanding of common humanity. That one of the things that happens with maturity is you start realizing, okay, we're all humans, we're all imperfect, and the sense of self and other isn't as separate. But anyway, we don't know a lot about this, but it's kind of interesting. In terms of the sources of self-compassion, there's a lot of reasons why we're self-compassionate or not. Some of them are cultural, but certainly early family experiences play a role, without a doubt. We have some research showing that people who grow up with very critical parents tend to be self-critical. In fact, when we teach these workshops on helping people be more self-compassionate, often if you ask people to get in touch with that self-critical voice, it sounds like someone familiar, someone from the past. Oftentimes we just internalize these voices. Attachment security, of course. If your parents were warm, responsive, loving, you tend to have more self-compassion than if your parents were rejecting or very inconsistent. What's interesting is not just parental criticism, but conflict in the home also seems to impact self-compassion. So for instance, maybe you aren't criticizing your kids, but you're going at it with your spouse, right? Or maybe even modeling a lot of self-criticism in front of your child. That's another way this can get internalized, the self-criticism. And of course, people who struggle most with self-compassion are those with histories of abuse, some sort of trauma in their early childhood. Because if you think about it, self-compassion taps into that caregiving system. So if at an early age, if that caregiving system gets intermixed with things like fear or harm, the system can be, not irreparably, but it can be damaged, right? The good news is research also shows that kids with trauma histories, when they're older, if they can learn to be more self-compassionate and use self-compassion as a tool to help process some of their early history, it's a really important coping mechanism. And those, things can be healed and repaired. So, there's some good news to that story as well. All right. I want to briefly take you through a little bit of data on a program I've developed with my colleague Chris Germer to teach self-compassion skills. And the story with this is I've been doing self-compassion research for many years, but I'm not a clinical psychologist. I had never taught a workshop in my entire life. I was just an academic. And I was going to actually a meditation retreat with Chris Germer, who's a psychotherapist, and said, "Oh, Kristin, I love your work. You know, you should start doing workshops to teach people how to be more self-compassionate." And I said, "You're crazy." You know, he's actually an expert in mindfulness and psychotherapy, does lots of workshops, and said, "No, Chris, you really need to develop a workshop to teach self-compassion skills." And then at that moment, the idea was born for the Mindful Self-Compassion program. And actually, after I stopped gabbing so much this morning, I'm going to give you some exercises from this program. But we've developed an 8-week training program called the Mindful Self-Compassion program that's designed to teach self-compassion skills. So the idea is we meet once a week for 8 weeks for 2.5 hours each week. And we use a variety of techniques, and we do teach some meditation, although it's not primarily a meditation training program, but we teach some meditation to evoke states of self-compassion. A lot of informal practices, a few of which I'll be teaching you today, to help people learn to be kinder to themselves. And also we give people various homework assignments, including, I didn't know you had these self-compassionate bracelets. This is part of the program, actually. Little reminders people can use in their daily lives to help them remember to be more self-compassionate. And we just published our first randomized controlled trial of the study, where we compared well-being changes for those who are taking our 8-week program compared to those who are on a waiting list to take the program. And 54 participants, gotta say, just up front, mainly white middle-aged women with graduate degrees. Or I hate to say kind of, these are the type of women who tend to sign up for these programs. What are you going to do? So just a little grain of salt. We haven't really tested it with other populations. I think it was still generalized, but there you go. So what do we find, basically? Really large increases in self-compassion after the program, 43% increase in self-compassion, which is great because we spend 8 weeks really building that self-compassion muscle, and it seems to really work. Also increase in some general mindfulness skills as well. We don't teach a lot of mindfulness exercises, but because you have to be mindful to be able to sit with your pain in order to give it compassion, that also increased. Some compassion for others increased, not that much, but I think there was a bit of a ceiling effect. In other words, most people came in with already quite high levels of compassion for others, so there wasn't that much room to grow. Big reductions in depression, anxiety, stress, also the tendency to avoid difficult emotions. Also increases in, especially in life satisfaction. We got a very big increase in life satisfaction. Also connectedness and happiness, but it's funny, the waitlist control group also kind of increased in connectedness and happiness. Very funny too, I gotta tell you. We did some follow-up to see what was happening, and actually most of the people on the waiting list weren't really waiting. They had bought my book and Chris's and were like going to our websites and listening to our guided meditations, so they felt connected and happy just being on that waiting list and reading the book. So anyway, so our books work as well, but not quite as much as the program. All right, and then we did a 1-year follow-up, 6 months in at 1 year, and all the gains were maintained. And this is important because with some of these programs, you see increases right after completion of the program, but they don't persist over time. But the goal is to really give people tools they can put in their own tool bag to use on their own after the program is ended to be more self-compassionate in daily life. And actually, I don't have this graph here, but life satisfaction actually significantly increased at a year, which to me suggests that the more you integrate self-compassion into your life, the more rich and satisfying and meaningful your life will be. All right, so I want to give us a little exercise, but before, maybe I'll take a moment to pause and let you ask questions, and then I'm going to do an exercise, and we'll take an actual break. Yeah?
We can see the benefits for teachers and for children, of course. Somehow I'm not convinced that administrators would go for this in terms of review of the teachers. I know there are some administrators here. I don't know how does the bosses really have a big effect on teachers' lives. I'm wondering how do they relate to this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is, some of you will find out for me. But there's a lot of skepticism at first about self-compassion. There really is. That's why whenever I talk about it, I always deal with the misconceptions. You know, it's not self-indulgence, it's not letting yourself off the hook, it's not weak. Luckily, there's such a strong empirical base now. This is an evidence-based practice, which is a nice, good word to use with administrators. This isn't just, you know, I heard this woman named Kristin, she talked about this great thing called self-compassion. I mean, there's a lot of data to support it, including increasing motivation. I think eventually we'll start seeing research in organizations showing it saves money because you've got more employee loyalty, less turnover, less burnout, et cetera. We aren't really there yet. But, you know, what can you do except maybe show them the data and say if this will help the well-being of your employees, then it'll probably help the well-being of your organization or school as well. But, you know, maybe you'll have to find out how to get the message across in a way that works. I would say dealing with the misconceptions up front is really important, though. I know what you're thinking. It's not this, and this is why. And this is the research to show that it's not. Yeah?
As an administrator, I'm here because I really want to bring this back. So I think there's positive ways as a teacher in an organization to be able to share just the research of the week, whether it's through sharing articles, or not, but I think there's more of a trend maybe within the independent schools, that's where I'm coming from. I know there's some public school administrators here too, that we're thinking about this.
And I think there is an awareness that self-esteem didn't do the trick. So what then? We just let people hate themselves? You know, this is the way you can deal with that need in a healthy way, not a destructive way. Yeah.
So I'm wondering if there's been much research done with this in youth, especially youth that are coming from environments that may have not been nurturing, or that the youth have PTSD already. And does it take longer? Is it as effective, or does it take the same amount of time as somebody who didn't have that type of environmental background?
Yeah, so there's been almost no research done on self-compassion with youth. I have one study looking at high school students where it showed really strong relationships to well-being. We're actually developing a middle schooler version of the scale, which will help. This is an area we just haven't gotten to yet. There's been some clinical work done, like I said, done with people with trauma histories, some sort of abuse histories. And it definitely is harder. There can be a lot of fear of self-compassion if you come from some sort of background of abuse, because again, the fear gets intermixed with the caregiving signals. But it can be worked through, but usually you need some therapy for that. But in general, just kids, we don't know yet. I suspect that it'll be a really strong resiliency factor, but the research isn't there. I wish it was. Let's see, take two more questions. I think you.
I'm an administrator in a public school, and I was really intrigued by the idea of self-compassion. I was thinking about it in terms of working with staff, and the notion of recognizing life is imperfect, and that we have folks who perfection, a lesson plan has to be perfect. Administrator walks in the room, lesson delivery has to be perfect. And that beating oneself up, really, you feel it in a school community. You feel it in the staff. It's exhausting.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering how that plays out when trickling down into students, that energy or that negative self-talk or presence, or so that was where my mind was going with that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I would just say yes. The more you cultivate a self-compassionate mind state, the more you're able to, it actually will help your motivation, it'll sustain your motivation, it'll give you the optimal emotional environment to do your best, and I think it does trickle down. We'll talk about that a little bit more too, but your own mind state, we know, impacts the mind state of others, so the more calm and compassionate you are, the more other people feed off that energy. I think there was one. Okay, I'll take a couple more questions. I want to give you a little exercise. So, yeah.
More of like a vocabulary question within the research. Is there a word? I mean, I know it's like pity or victim mentality, but you talked about the difference between self-compassion or just compassion and pitying. Like,
yes.
What's the language there in research?
Right. Well, so in research, I mean, I guess it's mainly me who talks about this and kind of think about it in non-academic circles. But this common humanity is key. What keeps self-compassion from being self-pity? Common humanity. So self-pity is woe is me. When I'm in lost in self-pity, I'm not thinking about anyone else. It just feels like just me who's suffering, just me who's going through this. And also self-pity exaggerates how bad things are, partly because of the self-focus. You have no perspective, right? So because of the mindfulness component and the common humanity component, it's saying, not poor me, but, wow, this is really hard, and it's hard for everyone, right? So that would be the big difference. Actually, in Buddhism, there's a term called near enemies, when things look really similar, but they're actually quite different. And pity is the near enemy of compassion, because it lacks this connectedness. All right, so let me lead you through what is perhaps the easiest and most portable, one of them, easiest and most portable exercises from the Mindful Self-Compassion program, and that's called the Self-Compassion Break. And this is something you can hopefully have in your back pocket to take out whenever you need it most. Okay? And by the way, at the break and lunch, I'll be around for more questions. That doesn't mean that's all you get. All right, so again, if you can put your pens or computers down. And I'd like to do this as a sort of mini meditation. It's not really a meditation, but it's an experience and an experiential exercise where I'd like us to go inward. So if you can close your eyes, or if you don't feel comfortable with that, at least cast them downward so that no one feels they're being watched by anyone else. Let's just take a couple deep breaths, since we've just been talking and thinking a lot, so to clear some of that out. Maybe recentering in the present moment, so just remembering that our bodies are here, maybe feeling your feet on the floor, your seat on the chair. And so what I'd like you to do is actually think of a situation in your life right now, a real situation, that you find mildly to moderately distressing. Okay, so in other words, I don't want you to think of the most difficult situation in your life right now. We want to take baby steps. But some situation that, you know, you're kind of upset about. It's difficult. Might be something happening at work or at home. And so there's probably a few situations you have to choose from, maybe lots. So try to choose one, okay? And interview the candidates, hire one for the job. Please raise your hand if you need a moment more to think of such a situation. Okay, we'll take a moment more, but if you have decided on the situation you'd like to think about right now, see if you can play it out in your mind. You know, allow it to become real for you in this moment. We may be removed externally, but the situation is still there. You know, who said what? What's going on? Trying to make it vivid in your mind's eye. Letting these words just drop into your awareness. This is a moment of suffering. All right, what you're going through right now, this is suffering. This is really hard. Can you let yourself just name it and validate that? This is a moment of suffering. And remembering that suffering is a part of life. You know, this is abnormal, and you aren't alone in your suffering. Suffering like the suffering you're experiencing right now. It's a part of life. So now I'd like you to take your hands over your heart center like we did earlier. Really feeling the warmth of your hands, the gentle pressure, the tenderness of your touch. So may I be kind to myself in this moment. And can you give yourself what you really need right now? Kindness, care, comfort. Allow yourself to really take that in. May I be kind to myself in this moment. And give myself the compassion that I need. Maybe some other words come to you which are just what you need to hear right now in light of the situation. Might be something like, may I have courage, or may I accept myself as I am. See if you can just listen. What do you need to hear right now in this moment of suffering to care for yourself? Can you give yourself what you need? And then releasing your hands from your body. And when you are ready, slowly opening your eyes. So does anyone mind sharing what happened for them? Maybe not with this situation, but when you first named it as suffering and then went through the various steps. Which you could probably see where you're really invoking the three elements of self-compassion, mindfulness, common humanity, and kindness. Yeah.
Well, I was at first when I'm thinking about the challenge that I face. I felt bad about it, but in what we're talking about, I don't want to say removed from it, but I was more aware of it's gonna be okay. I know it's gonna be okay.
Yeah.
Even though it's really what I'm thinking about is really hard.
Yeah.
And could change my life in a direction that I didn't. I don't really want it to go in, but.
So did saying the phrases and putting the hand on your body help kind of get that perspective? Yeah. And of course, we are out of the situation right now, but I tell you, if you do this when you're in the heat of it, and it's actually happening, it's amazing how powerful it can be. And we call it a break, just to take a little time out to say whoa. But how many people are surprised by just naming it as suffering, how that changed things? Yeah, you want to say something?
Yeah, that was what I was going to comment when you asked the question initially. I just would never have named it as suffering. So just when you said that, I was actually surprised, even though in this talk you have mentioned several times how the word suffering and compassion, the relationship between compassion and suffering. So I was like, oh yeah, and that but I didn't expect it, and I think that's interesting, and it felt like a great relief to be able to acknowledge it as suffering.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so funny, we so often aren't even really aware. And if you think about what has to happen with self-compassion, is we have to step outside of ourselves and say, poor darling, you're suffering, you know? But if you're lost in the suffering, you're lost in the storyline, you're lost in fixing it or avoiding it or fighting it, we can't do that. So stepping outside yourself with mindfulness and saying, you're suffering, that's the first step that's necessary to then open your heart to yourself.
And I was already thinking about how I wish I could respond differently in the interactions. I'm already in self-critical mode.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
There was a point during it where I felt myself imagining other people judging me for this, and then I managed to sort of turn that around and recognize that, you know, this internal problem, because mine was an internal situation, is something that other people wouldn't know. And so I was able to recognize the humanity that you're doing, that other people might also be struggling with this exact same thing. And it like just warmed the whole experience from this very cold, judgmental to like a, oh.
Yeah. Yeah, it's that common humanity component, again, cannot be overemphasized how important that is. Just remembering every single person in this room has very similar stuff they're going through. It just makes the burden so much lighter, or at least not as, you know, heavy.
I think to piggyback on that, it's the common humanity piece that took me out of this self-critical, the judgment of others mode on myself, and realized there was common humanity, and that what was happening was this other's judgment. I didn't have to own that, you know, like it kind of separated it as, okay, so I'm suffering based on their actions, but a lot of people probably are suffering with a similarity, and I don't have to really take that suffering because it's really their actions, and you know, like this is a common theme, and that I could let go. And that was kind of a shift for me, like to go, oh, I could really let go of this because I'm not the one judging, the other person is, and I don't have to take that in a way.
You don't have to take it so personally.
Exactly.
And that's the funny, you know, a lot of times, I get this especially from Buddhist scholars. What do you mean self-compassion? Aren't you like, isn't that kind of self-centered? Why do you even have to talk about the self? But isn't self-criticism like the most self-centered mind state, in the sense of all you're thinking about yourself and how inadequate you are and how you could be better? Ironically, by treating yourself as you would a good friend you cared about, you're kind of stepping out of yourself, and you're actually softening the sense of self, and that allows you to see the bigger picture and actually feel more connected to others. So it has just the opposite effect. I think back there with the glasses.
Yeah, I was going to say that the self-judgment usually triggers wanting to avoid those feelings and push them away, which doesn't allow you to sit with them for even a split second and actually say, oh, I have a choice that I can do this differently next time. So it was like this pattern that got broken because you asked us to sit with the uncomfortable feeling for a moment. And that was really great.
Yeah, and I'm sure Rick Hansen talked about this, you know, negativity bias. What happens is your focus gets very, very narrow, right? And we're just locked in the negative. And again, the beautiful thing about love, which is really what self-compassion is it's this positive emotion that actually allows you to step back and see the bigger picture. So, and sometimes that means your problem maybe wasn't as bad as you thought it was. You have to be a little careful with that. Some people start using this common humanity thing to mean, oh, you know, my problem's not a big deal. There are children starving in Ethiopia. You don't want to go that way either, because yes, there's different degrees of suffering, but every moment of suffering is worthy of a compassionate response. So it's not saying my suffering is more important or less important, but I am a human being and I suffer just like everyone else, and keeping it at that level. But yeah, it can really broaden your perspective. All right, take maybe 2 more comments, then I want to give us a little self-compassionate bathroom break. Okay, yeah.
What I was going to say is it was so lovely to be touching my own heart, and I don't think that we do that very much. You know, that touch piece is really important.
You know, when people report back to us after taking our 8-week program, they say the physical touch is probably the most easily used and reliable tool they take. By the way, I should say, just because of time, I did hands on heart, but it's really good on your own to experiment with the soothing touch that works best for you. Some people find like this or putting hands on the belly, or giving themselves a little hug is really useful. So I think you should experiment for yourself what works. For most people this seems to work, but it might even just depend on your emotion as well. Oh, yeah, and while you brought it up, I gotta just give you one little tip. You may be thinking, well, it's really when I'm at work and I'm in a meeting that I need the self-compassion, and this probably isn't going to go over very well, right? You know, what are people going to think? So this is another alternative you have, which we call the surreptitious self-hug, which looks like this. Try it. Do this with like squeeze your arm a little bit with the intention to care, like, oh, this is a moment of suffering. You know, suffering is part of life. Maybe be kind to myself. No one has to know. You know, you can hide it, but your body will still respond to this. It's just physiologically programmed to design to this. Your mind maybe can't go there, but your body can like kind of slip you through the cracks or something like that of self-compassion. So, all right. So I think we've heard from you already. So maybe we haven't heard from you yet, have we?
No.
We have it.
Okay.
I think that in this particular problem, when I focused on myself, it was such a strange feeling, because this whole situation, I'm trying to be patient with giving the other person my patience and feeling like I'm the one that's causing this problem almost, when I know I'm not. But that's the stance I've been taking for so long. Like, I'm the one causing this, so I have to make them. I got myself into this, so maybe I have to somehow let them have more space and concentrate on myself, which is like, whoa, I'm in this. Oh.
Yeah, you're suffering too.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good. All right, good. Well, let's take a 15-minute break. Will that be enough for y'all? Okay, and then we'll come back and we'll do some more practice when we get back.